So this is joint work with Hai Zhang, who's currently in a graduate program at MIT. I want to thank Olivia and the PRC organizers for including me, putting this great conference together and including me. So in this group, people are obviously very familiar with the extremely large drop in employment that followed the onset of the pandemic. And now that we're sort of 2 years in, we can see that that initial loss of 22 million jobs, or about 15% of employment, that we're back to a decrease of, we're down still about 1.5 or 2 million jobs, which actually looks a lot like the cumulative loss of employment sort of 2 years out of a lot of other recessions of the past 40 years, with the notable exception of the Great Recession, where it took more like 6.5 years for employment to return to pre-pandemic levels. So in terms of thinking about older workers and how they're affected by recessions, by weak labor markets, it used to be the case that being an older worker was somewhat protective of the risk of job loss, but that has become less true in recent years. We also know that this pandemic was really different from other recessions in terms of the service sector being so hard hit. And so I just wanted to mention that older workers are quite well represented in service occupations. In 2019, pre-pandemic, about 1 in 5 service sector workers was age 55 plus. Also, once older workers lose their jobs, they need to contend, or they run the risk of running into age discrimination. And there's some interesting work showing that both the probability of age discrimination and the effect, so that increases, and then the effectiveness of age discrimination protections decrease during recessions. Over on the supply side, this has obviously been an unusual pandemic because of the health factor. And so COVID health concerns may be particularly salient for older workers because the risk of complications and death increases with age. Further, workers 62 plus are a little bit different than younger workers in that they have access to Social Security as another source of income, and that may affect how they respond to a job loss. So for about 15 or 20 years, I think economists have been interested in this question of how labor market conditions affect retirement transitions. There's some early work showing that when workers are displaced, they have a higher risk of retiring as compared to non-displaced workers. And then there's a bunch of work showing that the area of unemployment and the local unemployment rate, as that is higher, that's associated with an increased probability of retirement, not only in the US, but in other developed countries. And moreover, it's not just a matter of the labor market, but there are long-term effects here on people's well-being. So if you experience a higher unemployment rate when you're age 62 to 64, you're more likely to be in receipt of Social Security income at those ages. And then because of the actuarial adjustment for early claiming, that means that lower benefit amount, it means that you're going to have permanently lower retirement income. And there's even research showing that experiencing higher rates of unemployment when you're in your late 50s or early 60s is associated with lower survival rates at older ages, plausibly due to the lower rates of employment, lower levels of health insurance coverage, and healthcare utilization that occur during those ages, especially before people are eligible for Medicare. So the idea of this paper was to revisit this relationship between recessions and retirement in the COVID era. And I think, there are reasons, actually, before I tell you more specifically about what we did in our analysis, I just wanted to talk a little bit about the Great Recession, what happened to retirement then, and whether that might be instructive or not instructive for what we would expect to see here. There are reasons to think that we would have experienced a larger increase in retirements during the Great Recession. As we've already seen from that first graph, the labor market rebounded particularly slowly, and it's come back more quickly during COVID. On the other hand, something that has been different between these two recessions is what's happened with the stock and housing markets. Those were hit obviously very hard during the Great Recession, which would have been expected to work kind of in the opposite direction of the labor market in terms of leading people to delay retirements and perhaps having a smaller net effect on retirement as a result. In this recession, after some initial declines, the stock and housing markets in general have gained a lot, and so those are all working in the same direction, leading workers to retire earlier. We also know that there's been an unprecedented level of government assistance during this recession, which may have impacted how some people have responded to a job loss, as well as those COVID-related health concerns. So this graph just shows the absolute change in employment to population ratio that occurred kind of before and after the Great Recession. This is quite a long time span here, right? 16 years. And so if we focus on the green, orange, and red lines, that shows that long-term trend towards working longer that's been happening during this era. And the green, which corresponds to workers 60 to 64, that upwards trend is sort of interrupted for just about 6 years, which is really the length of time that it took for the labor market to return to normal. But by contrast, the older group, 65 through 74, there's no break from trend, right? This trend towards working longer kind of continued unabated during this period. And I wanted to contrast that to what's happened now. This is obviously a much shorter time range. We're only looking for 2.25 years here. And I've added the prime age group of 25 to 54-year-old workers, because I think there's been a lot of interest in kind of who's been affected more by the COVID recession, younger, older workers. So in terms of the absolute change in employment to population ratio, there's a larger drop in work for the prime age workers. But if you sort of focus in on those red and yellow line or orange lines, sorry, you can see that employment has rebounded a lot more slowly for older workers. And 2 years into the pandemic, the employment to population ratio is still 2 percentage points lower for this older group, which again has sort of recovered more slowly than the employment to population for younger groups. So what we're actually doing in this paper then is to sort of basically follow the previous literature, but update it for this period. So we're estimating models of workers' transitions from employment to retirement. The factors we're particularly interested in are the state level unemployment rate, the monthly level of COVID cases in the state, as well as we use this index of the state government response to the pandemic, a pretty comprehensive measure that includes public health measures, economic response, things like school closings, et cetera. We also look at whether the worker is in a job that's teleworkable because of those healthcare concerns that may be particularly salient here during this pandemic. And these are models that control for demographics, age, state, and year-month fixed effects. So we're using the current population survey for about 5 years of data. We start with the sample of workers who are 55 to 74 and working at their first interview. And then because people are interviewed 8 times over 16 months, we are able to look at their monthly retirement transitions from employment to retirement. So these are our key findings, just summarized in a graph for hopefully easy consumption. The blue bars correspond to the effect during the pre-COVID period. The orange are the effects in the post-COVID period. And lighter shading means that these results are not statistically significant. So what we see in the pre-period, starting at the left of the graph with the unemployment rate, is that a 1-point increase in unemployment is associated with an increase in the probability of retirement of about 5% relative to the average. So that's consistent with what the past literature has found. On the other hand, if you look at the little orange bar next to it, during the pandemic period, that effect has effectively gone away. So people are more likely to retire during the pandemic than pre-pandemic, but not more so in places where the labor market is weaker. That's a bit of a surprise, I think. In terms of COVID cases, we don't find that the local area of COVID cases is having an impact on people's retirement transitions, but we do find that that this value of the COVID tracker, I should say this is on a 100-point scale, so I'm showing the impact of a 10-point increase in the tracker. The mean value is around 46 out of 100 during the post-pandemic period. So as governments have been more aggressive to the pandemic, that's associated with a reduction in the probability of retirement. And then finally, teleworkable. Let me just remind you, these are models that control for education. So conditional on your level of education, having a job where you can telework, that's always associated with a lower probability of retirement. But that effect has gotten about twice as strong during the pandemic as compared to pre-pandemic. So this is the same set of results, just separated for people before and after 62. And the main point of this is to show you that the unemployment results that we see for the sample as a whole are really being driven exclusively by the sample 62 plus. That's actually consistent with what the previous literature has found, and it suggests that Social Security, access to Social Security may be important in how people respond to, or why people respond to recessions in the way they do. On the other hand, the other factors, the government level of response to the pandemic and whether the job is teleworkable, those are important for both age groups. So just to quickly recap, what we're finding here is that a higher unemployment rate is associated with a higher probability of retirement before the pandemic, consistent with the past literature, but this relationship really disappears during the pandemic. We also see this effect only for workers 62 plus, again, consistent with what the past literature has found. We see that this stronger local government response to the pandemic is associated with a lower probability of retirement, but we don't see that local COVID cases are affecting people's retirement. And we see that being able to telework is always an important factor in retirement decisions, but that's gotten stronger during the pandemic. So I think there's a bit of a puzzle, like maybe we haven't completely, we're not completely all the way to the answers that we would want to have about what's going on here. People are retiring at a higher rate than prior to the pandemic, but they're not being more likely to do that in areas that are having more unemployment or more COVID. So we may want to look to other factors, the increases in stock and housing wealth. People could still be responding to a generalized common fear of COVID, even if they're not responding to the level of COVID in their national area. And also those federal policies could have played a role, and that's something that we haven't explored directly. So I just wanted to take my one last minute and just respond, reflect, given the theme of this conference, a little bit about what does this suggest about the resiliency of the retirement system. My thoughts go immediately to all the kind of public programs that are available to people. One interesting thing about Social Security is that we have seen this increase in retirement, but we actually haven't seen an increase in Social Security claiming yet. So I think that's a bit of a puzzle and something to keep our eyes on. We're also going to be looking to see if there's going to be an increase in Social Security disability insurance claiming. Past research has shown that those claims are cyclical and that the people who are kind of drawn in to claim during weaker labor market times are generally healthier than people who claim in other times, which I think is interesting. So that'll be something to keep an eye on. My own work suggests that in normal recessions, the unemployment insurance is not doing a lot to older workers are not really turning to unemployment insurance as a way to mitigate the shock, probably because benefits don't last for very long normally, but they've been extended during the pandemic. So I think that would be something worth exploring more, and also just thinking through all the implications of the losses of employer-sponsored health insurance, which actually were maybe not as big as we might have expected. So I'll just finish by saying I think there's a lot here for future research, and I loved Erica's talk because she got into the labor force reentry piece, which is a piece I've been really curious about, as well as whether this increase in retirement is going to be short-lived, what's going to happen with these other programs that I mentioned. The longer-term impacts on retiree well-being is something to think about, since the past literature suggests that when people retire earlier because of a pandemic, it affects their well-being. And finally, whether long COVID or all the COVID mortality that has happened during the pandemic could also change retirement patterns. So with that, I'll stop sharing. Thank you so much.